Everyone at the Public Safety Monitoring Center thought he was just a quiet janitor, until one humiliating afternoon when a little girl grabbed his hand and he whispered a name that froze the entire room. No one knew the truth he'd buried or the legend about to return to the light. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning shift at the City Public Safety Monitoring Center always began with a low hum that slowly built into a storm of activity. Rows of screens flickered to life one by one, each displaying live feeds of traffic accidents, fire alerts, drone paths, emergency calls, and heat maps of the city's busiest districts. Analysts took their seats with coffee still steaming in their hands. Dispatchers settled into headsets as the first wave of early calls started trickling through. Technicians huddled around consoles adjusting drone diagnostics. Supervisors shouted instructions from one end of the room to the other. It was a place where everything moved fast, where urgency was routine, and where every second was measured in human lives. Amid that constant rush, a single figure moved quietly through the main corridor, pushing an old mop bucket with a slow, steady rhythm. His green work shirt had no name tag, only the faded company logo stitched above the pocket. His dark hair, tied loosely at the back, fell over sharp eyes that rarely lifted to meet anyone's gaze. Most people never looked long enough to notice the quiet precision in the way he pivoted the mop or the way he instinctively stepped aside for incoming paramedics or officers rushing through. To the staff, he was simply Ken Rivers, the janitor, a man who blended into the background as easily as dust on the floor he cleaned. Every day, he arrived before sunrise to sweep the entrance hall, sanitize the stair rails, and clear out forgotten coffee cups from the desks of overnight workers. He performed each task with a gentle thoroughness that seemed almost out of place in a building defined by speed and urgency. Some thought he worked so quietly because he was timid. Others assumed he was broken down by life, beaten into silence by hardship. A few joked that someone like him must have done something terrible to end up mopping floors at a high-security center like this. No one guessed that the truth was the opposite. No one imagined that this man had once stood behind some of the city's most advanced rescue systems. Years earlier, he had helped design a set of drone-assisted protocols that saved dozens of lives during a historic flood. His name had been whispered among rescue teams with respect. He had personally funded the first 5 rescue drones after losing someone he loved to rising water and slow response times. Reporters had tried to find him. Officials tried to honor him, but he turned away from all of it. He walked out of the spotlight and never returned. Now he worked under a different name and under different circumstances. He chose anonymity. He chose simplicity. He chose a job that allowed him to keep moving without being recognized, questioned, or celebrated. And the center accepted him because he asked for nothing more than a quiet corner to begin again. Each morning, as the floor grew louder with urgent chatter, he kept wiping, sweeping, and emptying trash bins with steady patience. The world around him pulsed with emergency alerts. His world remained silent. It was the silence he needed, the silence he earned, the silence he hid inside. But that silence would not last much longer. Something was coming. Something he did not want, did not ask for, and could not avoid. And it would begin with a little girl running into his arms. Every day at exactly 3 o'clock, the rhythm of the building shifted in a way almost no one noticed. The drone ops team transitioned to mid-shift checks, the dispatch room swapped out headsets, and the analysts leaned back to stretch stiff shoulders. But the subtlest change came from the far end of the corridor, where the front doors slid open, and a small figure darted inside with the speed and certainty of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Emma Rivers, 8 years old, with dark hair tied in a bright yellow ribbon, rushed through the lobby like a burst of sunlight, cutting through the sterile walls of the center. Security guards greeted her with a smile. Analysts paused to wave. She always waved back her backpack, bouncing behind her, her steps full of joy that refused to be dimmed by the seriousness of the environment around her. And without fail, she headed straight for the same corner of the main corridor where her father always worked at that hour. Ken lifted his head the moment he heard her small feet skidding across the floor. His expression changed instantly. The calm, withdrawn stillness he carried all day warmed into something gentle and unmistakably alive. He placed the mop against the wall and opened his arms just in time for her to crash into him with the kind of hug only a child can give, wild, wholehearted, and without hesitation. "Daddy, I got an A on my reading test," she said, breathless, her voice echoing down the hallway. Ken smiled softly, smoothing her hair back. "Of course you did. You worked hard for it." She looked up at him with a pride that no medal ceremony or title could ever match. And for a moment, the noise of emergency calls, drone beacons, and tech alarms faded away. For a moment, the world was just a father and his daughter wrapped in a quiet love stronger than anything the center's walls had ever witnessed. Some staff smiled when they saw them. Others frowned, muttering things about a janitor bringing a child into a high-pressure workspace. But Emma never cared. She walked beside her father proudly, holding his hand, swinging their arms gently as he continued cleaning the floor. She would talk about her day, show him drawings from school, and ask questions about the flashing lights on the screens they passed. Ken answered simply, never revealing how much he truly knew about each of those screens. If anyone paid closer attention, they might have noticed how his eyes scanned emergency maps without needing to read labels. They might have noticed how he instinctively recognized the sound of different alert tones. They might have noticed how his posture shifted when a drone malfunction warning beeped. But no one looked for those things in a janitor. Emma did not notice her father's hidden knowledge. She only noticed the warmth in his voice, the steadiness in his hands, and the way he always knelt down to her height when she spoke. She noticed that he listened, really listened, and that was enough for her. Still, the peace of their afternoon routine would not last. Unbeknownst to them, a moment of public humiliation was approaching. A moment that would shatter the fragile anonymity Ken had carefully built. A moment that would drag his past back into the light. And it would all begin in the cafeteria, where the wrong man would ask the wrong question in front of the wrong crowd. The cafeteria at the Public Safety Monitoring Center was always crowded at mid-afternoon, filled with voices competing over the hum of vending machines and the clatter of trays. Analysts swapped stories from the morning shift drone trainees, compared flight logs, and supervisors hovered over their teams with the rigid authority that came from believing their jobs mattered more than anyone else's. It was the one place where rank experience and ego rubbed shoulders more than anywhere else in the building. Ken entered quietly with Emma beside him, carrying her lunchbox while she held his hand. They found their usual small table near the corner, far from the noise. Ken unpacked her food carefully, cutting her apple into small slices, making room for her drawings on the table. Emma chattered, happily oblivious to the glances cast their way. To her, this place was simply where her father worked. To everyone else, it was a reminder that a janitor occupied space they believed belonged to people with more important titles. At the far end of the room, Operations Chief Grant Marshall noticed them. His stride shifted, his jaw tightened. He thrived on moments where he could assert dominance, especially in front of new staff. Today, he saw an easy target, a janitor in a room full of professionals, a man he believed had no right to sit among them, a man whose quiet presence irritated him more than he cared to admit. He made his way toward the corner table, his entourage trailing behind him. Their laughter grew louder as they approached. Emma paused mid-sentence, looking up at the sudden shadow falling across her lunchbox. Ken didn't turn. He knew that tone. He had felt it before. The air changed. The first blow wouldn't be physical. It never was. It would come in the form of a question meant to belittle, to provoke, to draw attention, and that question would ignite everything that followed. The janitor's closet at the Public Safety Monitoring Center was barely large enough for a shelf of cleaning supplies, a metal sink, and a single wooden stool pushed into the corner. Yet for Ken Rivers, it was the one space in the building where silence felt like a friend instead of a void. The rest of the center pulsed with urgency. Operators shouted across the drone bay, dispatchers answered calls that carried panic, and analysts tried to make sense of shifting crisis maps. But inside this closet, the only sound was the soft drip of the faucet and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He wiped his hands on a towel and prepared his cleaning cart for the night shift routine. Most janitors preferred daytime hours, but he chose nights intentionally. Fewer people watching, fewer questions, fewer reminders of the past life he left behind. He could move through the hallways unnoticed, tending to the forgotten corners and quiet messes while the world outside spiraled with emergencies he no longer allowed himself to touch. Years ago, before tragedy carved its mark into his life, he had been deeply involved in the rescue technology community. It wasn't something he spoke about, not even when people around him made ignorant comments about his slow pace or unassuming posture. He once worked closely with drone engineers, emergency responders, and AI technicians. He had stood in rooms far brighter and louder than this one, surrounded by people who looked to him for guidance. But the brightest part of that life vanished when his partner fell ill, and the flood took them both from him, once in body, then again in memory. Grief found strange ways to reshape a person. Some people ran toward noise to distract themselves, others drowned in it. Ken chose quiet. After losing the woman he loved, he made a promise to himself to step away from anything that put him in the spotlight. Not because he felt unworthy, but because he needed space to breathe, without cameras capturing his pain or officials turning his loss into headlines. The director of the center, Elena Carter, had known who he was the moment he contacted her. She recognized his voice before he even gave her the name he wanted to use. But when he asked for anonymity, she granted it without hesitation. When he asked for the lowest possible position, she tried to offer something more stable. He refused. He wanted to sweep floors, mop halls, and quietly blend into a place where saving lives was still happening around him, even if he no longer played a direct role. He told her he needed to stay close to the mission without being part of it. She understood. She always had. Working under the name Ken Rivers, he built a daily routine centered on physical tasks that kept him grounded. Scrubbing, wiping, organizing, and cleaning weren't meaningless to him. They were a form of steadying himself. Each motion reminded him that he was still capable of contributing even if no one noticed. And he preferred it that way. No one needed to know he'd ever been anything more. The only exception to his solitude was Emma. His daughter was the reason he woke up each day with enough strength to walk into the building without collapsing under memories he tried to bury. Emma became the anchor that kept his world from drifting too far into sorrow. Every afternoon she arrived with the same bright smile and the same excited steps, bringing colors into a building defined by gray walls, blue screens, and fluorescent lights. While others saw a janitor's daughter wandering around the facility, Emma saw her father as the safest place in her universe. She didn't understand the weight he carried, nor did she see the quiet shadows behind his gentle smile. She only saw the man who packed her snacks, braided her hair on rushed mornings, and walked her home after long shifts. Her presence softened the edges of every difficult memory he tried to keep tucked away. Whenever she visited, he would prepare simple lunches for her: cut sandwiches, apple slices, and warm soup kept in a thermos. She always insisted on showing him her school drawings while she ate. Sometimes they were stick figure families, sometimes they were pictures of the city skyline, and sometimes they were sketches of him taller than everyone else around her, holding her hand in every picture. She always drew him with a smile. He never corrected her, even though he rarely felt like smiling anymore. Instead, he would lift her drawing trace, the crayon lines with his finger, and say, "This is beautiful. I love it." Their moments together created a small bubble of peace in the building. But outside that bubble were whispers he never acknowledged. Some staff assumed he was a washed-up technician who failed his way into a janitorial job. Others believed he had a criminal record or suffered a mental breakdown. A few made jokes when they thought he was out of earshot. They mocked the way he moved slowly and methodically, mistaking mindfulness for incompetence. They teased him for kneeling whenever Emma spoke, thinking it made him look weak, never realizing it came from a lifetime of treating others with patience and respect. He never corrected them. Rumors were safer than the truth. Lies kept people from asking the questions he couldn't answer. As long as they believed whatever stories they told themselves, they would never look deep enough to discover who he used to be. Occasionally, a few people tried to provoke him. They would deliberately bump into his cleaning cart, kick over a trash bin, or make snide jokes about his appearance. He absorbed each slight quietly, never raising his voice, never responding with anger. He had learned long ago that tempers burned bridges and anger made wounds deeper. Silence, on the other hand, protected him. Stillness gave him control, and humility, though misunderstood by most, gave him a way to survive the chaos inside his heart. Those who laughed at him did not see the truth. They did not see the man who once spent sleepless nights guiding drones into disaster zones. They did not see the man who once held the lives of strangers in his hands while fire and wind tore through the city. They did not know that every scar on his arms came from a rescue mission gone wrong. They only saw a janitor. Emma didn't care what others whispered. She only saw her father as someone strong, steady, and kind. And every time she wrapped her arms around him, she unknowingly reminded him that he still had something worth living for. There were moments, especially during the quietest hours of the night shift, when Ken paused in the middle of an empty hallway and let the stillness settle around him. In those moments, he often thought about how different life had become. Years earlier, his days were filled with pressure, responsibility, and the relentless urgency of saving others. Now his nights were filled with the sound of his mop sliding across tiles and the distant echoes of passing footsteps. And strangely, he found comfort in it. The simplicity helped him breathe. The routine kept him steady. Yet underneath that calm surface, he carried storms that never fully faded. He knew some staff believed his slow, deliberate movements came from laziness or lack of skill. What they didn't understand was that everything he did was intentional. He had learned through years of crisis work that moving gently was sometimes the only way not to break. When he paused to tie Emma's shoe or help her pick up a spilled juice box, he did so with the care of someone who had once lost everything and vowed never to let anything fragile slip from his hands again. To Emma, he was simply her father. To those who mocked him, he was forgettable. But to himself, he was a man learning how to exist without drowning in expectations he could no longer meet. Humility was not a disguise. It was his healing. He didn't need people to understand why he chose this path. He didn't need them to know the truth he hid behind the name Ken Rivers. All he needed was the quiet assurance that he could raise his daughter without the noise of fame or the burden of his past. And for a time, it seemed enough. But the world had a way of pulling old truths into the light. And soon, his quiet life would crack open in front of everyone. Elena Carter walked the length of the Public Safety Monitoring Center with the kind of purposeful stride that came from years of balancing pressure, responsibility, and the weight of knowing every decision she made could affect someone's life. As the senior technology director, she was used to scanning rooms, quickly absorbing details others missed, and sensing when something was out of place. On that particular afternoon, she wasn't looking for problems. She was simply doing her usual rounds, checking on drone diagnostics, reviewing system updates, and making sure every team was operating smoothly. But something caught her eye before she even realized she was staring. Ken Rivers, the quiet janitor with a mop in one hand and a bucket rolling behind him, moved with a deliberate grace that didn't match the job he held. It wasn't elegance in the sense of polished theatrics. It was precision. Every step was balanced. Every shift of his weight was subtle but controlled. His posture was straight, not rigid, but naturally aligned like someone who had spent years carrying tension in their core. Elena paused mid-stride, watching him for a moment longer than necessary. She had seen janitors come and go over the years. Some rushed, some dragged, some leaned on their carts with boredom or exhaustion. But none moved like this man. His motions had intention, like he was still listening to signals no one else could hear. Even the way he adjusted the mop handle looked practiced, almost tactical. Elena frowned slightly, her mind pulling threads together. Something about him didn't belong in the category people had placed him in. Her attention shifted when Emma trotted into the hallway waving at her father with the unfiltered joy only a child could carry. Ken noticed his daughter instantly pausing the mop and kneeling so he could greet her at eye level. His movement softened, transformed, as if someone had flipped a switch inside him. There was no sternness in the way he corrected her when she ran too quickly. No raised voice, no frustration, only a calm, gentle guidance. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steady but light, and she immediately slowed her pace, listening. It was the kind of interaction that came from someone who understood both authority and kindness deeply, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to teach a lesson. Elena felt a warmth settling in her chest as she watched them. She had always admired quiet parenting, the kind that relied on steadiness instead of control. Something about the way Ken interacted with Emma reminded her of people she used to work with in the early days of crisis response, people who carried heavy burdens, but never let the weight disrupt the way they treated others. It was rare to see that kind of gentleness in someone who worked a job most people dismissed. She continued down the hall, but her mind lingered. She had seen Ken many times before, always silent, always focused, always moving with that same unusual intention. She had dismissed it as habit or personality, but now, watching the way his eyes flickered briefly toward a nearby alert screen when a missing person report flashed on it, she realized it wasn't habit at all. It was awareness. Deep, trained awareness. Something about this janitor didn't add up. Not at all. And Elena Carter was not the type of person to ignore a mystery hiding in plain sight. Elena continued her rounds, but her attention drifted back to the janitor more than once. Something small, almost imperceptible, kept pulling her focus toward him. Each time an alert tone sounded from the dispatch room, Ken paused for a fraction of a second. Not visibly to the casual observer, but enough for someone trained like her to notice. His eyes shifted toward the source of the sound with a recognition she couldn't ignore. It wasn't the idle curiosity of a passerby, it was the instinctive response of someone who understood those tones intimately. She stopped near the central console, pretending to check drone telemetry reports while discreetly watching him from a distance. When a technician announced a temporary drone outage in District 9, most of the staff barely reacted. But Ken stiffened just slightly, his fingers tightening around the handle of the mop before he deliberately relaxed again. He resumed working, but his gaze lingered on the outage report displayed across the nearest screen. He scanned the map like someone who could interpret it without needing explanation. This wasn't normal, not for a janitor, not for someone who supposedly didn't know anything about the systems, not for someone who was expected to sweep around the edges of the operation and go unnoticed. A memory tugged at Elena's mind, a report she had read years earlier about a drone operator who guided a failing rescue drone through a hurricane-strength storm to map escape routes for trapped responders. The operator had been described as impossibly calm under pressure, unusually precise with controls, and intensely aware of situational changes during missions. She pushed the thought aside quickly, telling herself she was overanalyzing a coincidence. That operator had disappeared. Some believed he died. Others believed he quit after suffering personal loss. No one truly knew. Still, the idea lingered. Later that afternoon, Elena walked past the cafeteria just as Ken and Emma were packing up their things. Emma showed her father a drawing she had made of the center. The building looked crooked, the windows uneven, the drone on the roof far larger than scale. But Ken's face softened as he praised each detail. The gentleness in his voice caught Elena by surprise again. It wasn't the tone of someone speaking to a child because they had to. It was the tone of someone who treasured every second with her, someone who had learned to cherish moments others took for granted. What struck Elena most wasn't the tenderness, it was the discipline beneath it. When Emma ran ahead toward the hallway, Ken's posture shifted instantly. It was subtle, but unmistakable. His shoulders lifted slightly, his gaze sharpened, and he moved after her with smooth, calculated steps, not hurried, but ready. Ready for what she wasn't sure. But that readiness didn't belong to a man who had only ever held a mop. She found herself studying him more closely throughout the day. His awareness didn't flicker on and off, it was constant. When an officer spilled a cup of coffee near a critical console and others panicked, Ken moved before anyone else reacted. He caught the falling cup, stabilized the officer with one hand, and kept the liquid from splashing onto the equipment with a quick, controlled motion. It happened too fast for anyone to process. To most people, it looked like luck. To Elena, it looked like training. And with every passing moment, the question grew louder in her mind. Who exactly was this man pretending to be a janitor? As the day moved toward evening, Elena found herself lingering near the observation deck where the large emergency screens looped through real-time updates. She wasn't there to oversee anything. She was there because she knew he would eventually walk past during his nightly sweep. When he appeared at the end of the hall, pushing his cart with slow, steady movements, she watched him carefully. His eyes didn't wander like most people's. They scanned. They assessed. They absorbed information with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years relying on rapid interpretation to make life-or-death decisions. Ken paused briefly near the missing persons alert board. A new case had just been posted, a teenager lost near the city's outskirts. The room murmured with concern as analysts prepared to route drones for the initial sweep. Ken's jaw tightened for a moment. It was the smallest reaction, the kind most would ignore, but Elena saw it. She saw the pain behind it. She saw the memory it stirred, and she realized he cared more deeply about rescue work than he tried to let on. He resumed mopping quieter than usual, his shoulders carrying a weight she couldn't define. Elena's mind raced. She had hired dozens of people in her lifetime. She had trained operators, technicians, analysts, and specialists, but never, not once, had she met someone who could hide skill so well while displaying discipline without even realizing it. She didn't confront him. She didn't speak his name. She didn't approach. She simply watched, intrigued, almost unsettled by the contradiction standing in front of her. A janitor with the awareness of a responder. A father with the posture of a protector. A quiet man whose silence hinted at storms he refused to unleash. And for the first time, she knew with absolute certainty that Ken Rivers was not who he appeared to be. The cafeteria inside the City Public Safety Monitoring Center was always loud at midday, a restless hive of people who spent their lives watching disasters unfold on screens. Analysts huddled over tablets, drone operators compared flight logs, dispatch coordinators used their lunch breaks to vent about long shifts and impossible deadlines. The room buzzed with constant urgency, but at the far corner, away from the clusters of badges and work vests, Ken Rivers sat quietly with Emma. Their little table pushed against the window felt like a pocket of peace inside a building that rarely knew it. Ken opened a small lunchbox and placed 2 peanut butter sandwiches on napkins. Emma swung her legs under the chair, humming happily as she unpacked her crayons and showed him her drawing of a giant rescue drone carrying a kitten to safety. Ken smiled softly, listening as though nothing in the world mattered more than her voice. Across the room, some staff noticed them and whispered. A few nudged each other, rolling their eyes at the sight of a janitor eating lunch in the same space where technical specialists discussed emergency protocols. Others pointed at Emma, confused why a child was sitting among professionals. But Ken remained calm. His posture relaxed, his focus entirely on his daughter. He never let the noise of judgment interrupt her joy. The heavy cafeteria door swung open, suddenly loud enough to cut through the chatter. Grant Marshall, the operations chief, marched inside with his entourage of supervisors trailing behind him. He was known for his arrogance and the unnecessary authority he carried like a badge. His boots hit the floor with sharp steps, and his voice rose immediately as he complained about the morning shift. His eyes swept the room, searching for something to criticize. When he spotted Ken and Emma in the corner, a smirk crawled across his face. Without hesitation, he veered toward them, shoving past analysts who scrambled out of his way. "Well, look what we have here," Marshall announced loudly, making sure half the cafeteria heard him, the mop man and his little assistant taking over the lunchroom. Several nearby tables chuckled. A few analysts looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Emma froze mid-bite, her shoulders tensing as she instinctively pressed closer to her father. Ken didn't react. He took a slow sip of water and placed a gentle hand on Emma's back to steady her. Marshall wasn't satisfied with being ignored. He stepped closer, shaking his head dramatically. "You know, Rivers," he said, drawing out the name as though it tasted sour. "Everywhere I go, there's a trail of mop water. Maybe you should stick to cleaning closets instead of taking up space here." Laughter broke out again. Some people laughed because they thought it was funny. Others laughed because they didn't want Marshall targeting them next. Emma's fingers tightened around her sandwich, her eyes beginning to sting with embarrassment. Ken kept his calm. Stillness radiated from him like a quiet shield, but Marshall wanted more humiliation. He leaned toward the table, crossing his arms. "Tell me, Janitor," he said loudly. "What's your call sign, bucket boy?" The cafeteria erupted in laughter, and Emma's face crumpled. Ken placed his hand gently on her back. "My daughter is eating," he said softly but clearly. "Please, step back." The room fell silent, not because they respected him, but because no one expected a janitor to speak with such calm, grounded authority. For a few seconds, no one moved. Forks hovered in midair. Conversations froze. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter. The entire cafeteria stared, surprised that the most invisible man in the building had spoken with a calm that felt stronger than any shouted command. Grant Marshall blinked, thrown off by the subtle firmness in Ken's voice. He had expected fear or anger or some kind of reaction he could twist into another joke. Instead, he had been met with a stillness that made his chest tighten with irritation. "Oh!" Marshall scoffed loudly, forcing a laugh to cover the awkward silence. "Excuse me, didn't mean to interrupt your peanut butter banquet." His entourage laughed again, though more quietly now. They exchanged glances, unsure whether they should continue mocking or stay silent. Something about Ken's tone had shifted the air, even if they didn't understand why. Emma pressed closer to her father, her small hands fisting his sleeve. Her cheeks flushed with humiliation, her eyes bright with the sting of unwanted attention. She didn't look at Marshall. She didn't look at the crowd. She only looked at Ken, waiting to see if he would be angry or sad or hurt. But Ken didn't give Marshall the satisfaction of emotion. He simply continued peeling the crust off Emma's sandwich, placing the pieces neatly on her napkin the way she liked. His hands were steady, his face was calm, his breathing didn't change. And that calmness unsettled Marshall more than any angry reaction could have. From across the cafeteria, Director Elena Carter watched her expression tightening with irritation. She had seen Ken interact with Emma many times. Kindness was never weakness in him. It was intention. It was choice. A quiet discipline shaped by something deeper than the simple life he pretended to live. But seeing Marshall towering over him, humiliating him in front of his daughter, ignited something in her chest she didn't expect. Anger. Protective anger. Not for the janitor he pretended to be, but for the man she sensed beneath the surface. Marshall leaned in again, refusing to be dismissed by silence. "You think this place is a daycare," he said loudly. "You bring your kid here every day, letting her run around like it's a playground." Emma's lip trembled. She opened her mouth, ready to defend her father, but Ken rested a hand lightly on her arm. She closed her mouth again. She trusted him more than she feared any insult. Ken lifted his eyes to Marshall, calm but direct. "My daughter waits for me after school," he said. "She stays here because she feels safe." Marshall rolled his eyes so dramatically it almost seemed rehearsed. "Safe," he echoed mockingly. "This is a high-level public safety facility, not a—" He never finished. Because Elena Carter stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the tile. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She simply said, "Chief Marshall." Instantly, the room snapped to a different kind of attention. Marshall straightened, though his face twisted with annoyance at being interrupted. Elena rarely entered the cafeteria during busy hours, and when she did, it wasn't to socialize. Elena's eyes flicked to Emma's trembling hands, then to Ken's steady posture. "That's enough," she said. Her tone was calm, but steel-lined every syllable. The room held its breath. Marshall opened his mouth, ready to defend himself, but Elena's look stopped him cold. She didn't glare. She didn't scold. She simply stared in a way that made even seasoned operators reconsider their choices. Marshall backed up one step, only one. But everyone saw it. Emma exhaled shakily, gripping her father's arm. And Ken, still calm, still composed, whispered gently to her, "Eat your lunch, sweetheart." For the first time, a few people in the cafeteria looked away from them, not in judgment, but in quiet shame. Marshall forced out a laugh, trying to recover his image, but the cafeteria no longer echoed it. The earlier amusement had drained from the room, replaced by something heavier. People kept their heads down, suddenly interested in their food, unwilling to support him further now that Elena had intervened. He turned back toward Ken, hoping to regain control, but the moment was gone. The power he had tried to wield now hung awkwardly in the air, slipping through his fingers. Ken didn't look at him. He didn't give Marshall even a moment of attention. He focused entirely on Emma, cutting her sandwich into smaller squares, the way she preferred, speaking to her softly enough that only she could hear. That quietness felt like a dismissal. And to a man like Marshall, dismissal was worse than defiance. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off toward the serving counter, shoving a chair aside with unnecessary force. His entourage followed quickly, whispering nervously, unsure where the line now stood. Elena remained still for a long moment, her eyes tracing the curve of Ken's shoulders, the gentle way he reassured Emma, the steadiness that never cracked even under humiliation. She had seen people break under far less pressure than that one scene, but Ken had absorbed it without flinching, not because he was numb, but because he chose not to react. That kind of control came from training, not temperament. Elena walked toward the exit, her mind racing faster than her steps. Every instinct she had, sharpened through years in crisis response, told her the same thing. This man was carrying something far heavier than a mop bucket. And whatever it wasn't the burden of a simple janitor. It was the burden of someone who once held responsibility far too great for anyone in this building to imagine. And she was more certain than ever that the truth would surface soon, whether he wanted it to or not. The hallway outside the drone telemetry lab was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of lull that settled over the building once the busy lunch hours faded and most of the analysts returned to their workstations. Elena Carter walked slowly, reviewing notes on her tablet, her mind bouncing between operational reports and the unsettling scene she had witnessed in the cafeteria earlier. She wasn't the kind of leader who intervened in every conflict, but something about the way Ken handled that humiliation stayed with her. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a calmness that bordered on trained discipline. As she approached the janitorial supply alcove, she saw him again. He stood near the sink, sleeves rolled up as he wrung out a mop head under running water. His posture was grounded, balanced, the same controlled precision she had noticed before. Emma sat nearby on a small stool, swinging her legs, while drinking juice from a small carton, talking to him about a drawing she planned to finish later. Elena almost passed by without stopping, but then Ken adjusted his grip and pushed up his sleeve a few inches higher. That's when she saw it. A scar, long, deep, and jagged, ran along the length of his forearm. It wasn't the kind of scar one earned from slipping on a wet floor or mishandling equipment. It was thick, uneven, and pale from years of healing. The kind of scar left behind by shrapnel metal fragments or the explosion of a malfunctioning drone. Elena's steps slowed. She didn't mean to stare, but her eyes locked onto that mark with a shock that rippled through her memory. Her mind jumped back years, to a smoke-filled operations room, to emergency screens flashing red, to the live camera feed of a burning building collapsing floor by floor while firefighters were trapped inside. She remembered the operator who had taken control of 3 failing rescue drones that day, ignoring the warnings, overriding the safety protocols, and steering them through the collapsing corridors to create escape paths. She remembered the room going silent as he threaded each drone through the smoke, debris, and chaos with impossible precision. His call sign appeared on every report afterward. Lone Eagle. A man who could fly anything, navigate anything, and stay calm when others froze. A man who vanished months after the mission. Some whispered he died from wounds. Others said he quit after losing someone close. No one ever confirmed the truth. The classified files ended abruptly, and now here she stood, watching a janitor rinse a mop while a scar burned across his arm like a chapter of a story he no longer claimed. The hallway felt smaller, the air heavier. Elena's pulse thudded as the weight of possibility pressed into her chest. Could this man, the man everyone mocked, the man who knelt to tie his daughter's shoes, be the same operator who had saved lives by risking his own? She didn't ask. She didn't breathe his name. She only stood there silently, taking in the contrast between the scar that hinted at violence and the tenderness with which he now lived. Ken turned slightly, handing Emma a wet paper towel so she could clean the juice that had dripped onto her hands. She giggled as he helped her, the softness in his expression almost heartbreaking in its gentleness. What kind of man carried a scar like that and chose anonymity and toilets to scrub? Elena wasn't sure, but she knew she needed to find out. Elena forced herself to continue walking, but her steps slowed until she stopped near the corner, hidden enough to observe without looking intrusive. She watched as Ken finished wringing out the mop, testing the handle with a small adjustment that looked more like a practiced calibration than a janitor checking simple equipment. Every movement carried intention. Every shift of his weight seemed to follow a rhythm formed long before he ever held a cleaning tool. Her eyes returned to the scar. It ran from the midpoint of his forearm down toward his wrist, jagged in places where fragments must have torn through skin. It was a wound earned in chaos, not carelessness. She remembered reading the after-action reports. The Lone Eagle incident had involved a drone engine rupture during his final maneuver. Shrapnel had burst back toward the console, injuring the operator despite the protective barriers. The medics said he shouldn't have been able to keep the drones flying in those last seconds. But he did. He saved the firefighters. Then he disappeared. And now here he was in a dim hallway rinsing a mop like it was the most ordinary task in the world. Ken dried his hands and turned to Emma, brushing a strand of hair off her cheek. She grinned up at him with a trust so complete it made something shift inside Elena. A man carrying that kind of scar and that kind of gentleness did not fit into the narrow box the world placed him in. Emma lifted her small hand sticky from the juice she spilled earlier. Ken reached for a clean towel, knelt, and washed her fingers one by one with the patience of someone who had learned to slow down in life. Not because he lacked skill, but because he had once lived too fast, too intensely, and paid too high a price. The tenderness in his actions contrasted sharply with the warlike wound on his arm. Elena realized that contradiction wasn't random. It was a story carved into a man's life. A story of someone who once navigated danger and precision under unimaginable pressure, but now chose simplicity as a form of healing. Emma sighed when her hands were clean, leaning into her father's shoulder. He smiled, slightly tapping her nose with a light touch that made her giggle again. Then he stood, rolled down his sleeve carefully to hide the scar, and returned to preparing his cart for the next area he needed to clean. Elena watched the sleeve cover the evidence of his past, and she felt something tighten inside her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't suspicion in the dangerous sense. It was respect mixed with confusion, an ache to understand the story behind that quiet strength. Why did a man who once controlled drones in life-or-death missions now mop floors and keep his eyes lowered? What pain had pushed him into hiding behind an alias? Why did he choose anonymity in a world that would have praised him for saving lives? And most importantly, why did he look at this place? The buzzing center of public safety with the familiarity of someone who had once lived inside its heartbeat. Questions multiplied in her mind, rising faster than she could control. She thought about speaking to him, asking him directly, but something about his gentle posture stopped her. He wasn't guarding a secret. He was protecting a wound. Elena took a quiet breath, torn between her duty as a leader and her instinct as a human being. One thing was unmistakably clear. That man was no ordinary janitor, and her suspicion, once a whisper, now roared like undeniable truth. Elena stepped closer, pretending to inspect a wall sensor as Ken prepared to move his cart down the corridor. She didn't speak, but she watched him long enough to see another detail she hadn't noticed before. When he gripped the cart handle, his fingers settled into a subtle formation, almost like muscle memory, shaped by years of operating precise controls. Not tense, not even deliberate. Simply natural, as if his hands still remembered the shape of a console they hadn't touched in a long time. Emma reached up, tugging at his sleeve. He lifted her effortlessly with one arm, settling her on his hip with the ease of someone who had carried her through both joy and sorrow. She wrapped her arms around his neck, trusting him completely, unaware of the storm of questions swirling in Elena's mind. He whispered something to Emma that made her laugh again, and the sound echoed softly down the hallway, gentle, healing painfully out of place beside the scar on his arm. Elena watched them walk away, the mop bucket rolling steadily behind them, the truth following just as quietly. The scar, the posture, the awareness. It was becoming impossible to deny. Ken Rivers was hiding a life the world had forgotten. Evening settled softly over the small park beside the Public Safety Monitoring Center, tinting the sky with fading streaks of gold and blue. The center's distant hum blended with the rustling leaves and the faint squeak of the playground swings. It was the hour when most employees hurried home, eager to leave behind the weight of emergencies and flashing red alerts. But for Ken Rivers and his daughter Emma, this quiet corner was the part of the day they cherished most. Ken sat on a worn wooden bench watching Emma run across the grass toward the slide. She carried the kind of innocent excitement that lit up even the dimmest spaces. Her backpack dangled from one shoulder and her sneakers left small patterns in the dust as she climbed the ladder to the top of the slide. She waved at him proudly before sliding down with her arms lifted, her laughter echoing through the cool air. For a few minutes, everything felt simple, peaceful, a fragment of normal life carved out of a world filled with urgency. Ken took a slow breath, grateful for these moments when time felt gentle. But as Emma climbed the ladder again, she hesitated halfway. Her shoulders slumped slightly. She turned her head and called out to him in a voice far quieter than before. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" Ken's attention sharpened immediately. He stood and walked to the base of the slide, kneeling so his eyes met hers. Emma climbed down the rest of the way and stood in front of him, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Her earlier joy had faded, replaced by uncertainty. "Why do people look at you like you're nobody?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Some kids from the center said their parents told them that you must have done something bad to end up cleaning floors." Those words hit him harder than any insult thrown his way in the cafeteria. Ken kept his expression soft, but inside something heavy stirred. He had expected adults to judge him, but hearing that their children repeated those judgments to his daughter carved a deeper wound than he anticipated. Emma's eyes shone with confusion rather than anger. She wasn't accusing him. She was trying to understand a world that didn't make sense to her. The world could be harsh, but she still believed kindness should be obvious and fairness should be automatic. He reached out and smoothed her hair, then sat on the bench and gently pulled her beside him. She curled against his side, small hands folded in her lap, waiting for the truth. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "people judge quickly when they don't understand something." Emma's brow furrowed. "But you're the best daddy. You're kind. You help people all the time. Why would they say bad things about you?" Ken looked out toward the empty swings, thinking of the years behind him, the missions, the losses, the choices that pulled him away from the world until he found shelter in anonymity. He breathed slowly before answering. "Sometimes," he said, "people think they know someone just by looking. They see a job or a uniform or the way someone walks, and they decide a whole story in their heads." Emma leaned into him more. "But the story they made up isn't true." "No," he said gently, "it isn't." He didn't correct the children. He didn't defend himself to their parents. All he had ever wanted was to live quietly, to raise his daughter in peace, far from the shadows of what he used to be. "And you know what," he added, placing a finger under her chin so she would look up at him. "Being judged doesn't change who we really are." Emma swallowed, trying to make sense of it. "So, it's okay if they think wrong things?" It hurts, he admitted. But yes, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay quiet, instead of fighting every misunderstanding. Emma nodded slowly, but her next question would cut even deeper. Daddy, did you ever help people? Like in my teacher's stories? Ken held her a little tighter, knowing the truth mattered, but so did protecting her heart. Ken stayed quiet for a moment, letting Emma's questions settle in the space between them. The playground lights flicked on one by one, casting a soft glow over the slide, the swings, and the mulch beneath their feet. The world around them faded into gentle background noise. What remained was the look on his daughter's face, hopeful, vulnerable, searching. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want the weight of his past to become a shadow over her childhood. She deserved brightness, not the heaviness of everything he had carried. Sweetheart, he said finally, I still help people, just in different ways now. Emma blinked up at him. But did you help people before? Like heroes do. He exhaled slowly, the memories flickering behind his eyes. The screams in his headset, the collapsing buildings, the drones flying through fire and smoke, while he manually guided them through hallways where no human could reach in time. The silence that followed when he learned who hadn't survived, the reason he walked away. I tried, he said softly. I did what I could. But helping people isn't always about big things. Sometimes it's about showing kindness even when no one notices it. Emma toyed with a loose thread on her sleeve, thinking deeply. Is that why you clean the center? He smiled gently. I clean because it's quiet, because it gives me time to think, and because helping doesn't always look like what people expect. A breeze passed through the playground carrying the sound of traffic from the nearby street. The light caught the side of Emma's face, highlighting her innocence and the trust she placed entirely in him. But why do they think you did something bad? She asked. You never do mean things. You don't yell. You don't push people. You help me with everything. Her voice wavered on the last sentence, and it pierced him in a way no insult ever had. He cupped her cheek gently. People sometimes tell stories to make themselves feel bigger, he said. And sometimes they don't understand why someone would choose a simple job when they could do something else. Emma frowned. But you don't care about being big. No, he whispered. I just care about being your dad. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his chest with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. He held her close, closing his eyes as he let the moment ground him. All the noise of the world, all the assumptions and judgments faded away when she was in his arms. She reminded him of what mattered. She reminded him why he walked away from a life filled with danger and praise. As he held her, footsteps approached on the sidewalk. Elena Carter slowed as she passed the park, heading toward the street where she usually caught her evening rideshare. She hadn't meant to linger, but the sight of Ken comforting his daughter stopped her mid-step. She wasn't close enough to hear every word, but she caught enough the tone of reassurance, the softness in his voice, the way Emma clung to him as if he were her anchor in a confusing world. Elena's heart tightened unexpectedly. The scar she had seen earlier hinted at pain and sacrifice, but this moment showed something else. Quiet strength, deep love, and a desire to protect his daughter from the harshness he had endured. She saw not a man running from a past, but a father choosing love over legacy. She remained still for a moment longer before continuing down the path, her thoughts racing faster with every step. Emma pulled back slightly and looked up at him, her eyes clearer now, though still touched by worry. So, you're not nobody, she said softly. Ken smiled, the kind of smile that carried both warmth and quiet sadness. No one is nobody, he answered. Not you, not me, not even the people who say unkind things. Emma thought about that for a moment, then rested her head on his shoulder. I like who you are, she whispered. Those words settled deep inside him, easing a part of his heart he rarely acknowledged. As the last light faded from the sky, Ken stood and lifted her into his arms. She wrapped her legs around his waist, trusting him completely. He carried her across the park toward the center's parking lot, unaware that Elena had stopped once more at the edge of the sidewalk, watching them disappear into the evening, and knowing without doubt that this man was far more than he allowed himself to be. The next morning arrived with the same routine quiet that always filled the first floor of the Public Safety Monitoring Center. The early sunlight slipped through the tall glass panels, casting soft reflections across the polished floors. Ken Rivers walked beside Emma, her small hand wrapped around his, her backpack bouncing lightly against her side. They always arrived early before the building grew loud and frantic. It was their peaceful window before the world woke up. But today, the peace did not last long. Down the hallway, near the training wing, a cluster of young drone trainees gathered in a loose circle. Most were new recruits fresh out of certification programs, eager to prove themselves, eager to sound important. Their laughter echoed too loudly in the quiet hallway, overlapping with fragments of conversation dripping with arrogance. "I'm telling you," one trainee said, grinning as he leaned against the wall. "Guys like him always end up here. Washed out couldn't pass." The basic controls probably crashed drones left and right. Another snorted, or fired from some tech company for being slow. "Look at him. He moves like he's 50. A third chimed in, nudging the others. Maybe he tried to join the rescue operator division and failed every test. Now he gets to mop up after the real team. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't check if anyone was listening. Talking down about someone made them feel bigger, sharper, more confident. It was a cheap kind of pride, but pride all the same. As Ken and Emma approached the group, shifted, smirking at each other, before one of them stepped deliberately into their path. He bumped his shoulder against Ken's as he passed, knocking a stack of freshly folded cleaning towels out of Ken's arms. The towels scattered across the floor like soft white petals. The trainee laughed under his breath. "Careful, old man. Don't trip." Ken didn't react. He knelt calmly, gathering the towels with slow, steady movements. His face was composed, but Emma felt the change immediately. She felt the tension ripple beneath his quiet exterior, the hurt. He never voiced the patience he always clung to. Her small hands balled into fists. Before Ken could say anything, Emma stepped in front of him, planting herself between him and the trainees. Her chin lifted, her voice trembling but brave. "Don't talk mean to my daddy." The hallway fell silent for a moment. The trainees froze, surprised by the sudden confrontation from a child. Their expressions shifted from amusement to discomfort to shame that flickered across their faces like they had been caught kicking something fragile. Ken gently reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. He rose slowly, kneeling beside her so their faces were level. "It's all right," he said softly. "You don't have to fight words with more words." Emma shook her head, her eyes glossy. But they were wrong. They were being mean. Ken brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Kindness is always stronger than cruelty. Always." A pair of footsteps echoed nearby. Elena Carter stood at the end of the hallway, holding a folder against her side, watching everything unfold. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the scene drew her in instantly. The anger she felt toward the trainees flared hot, but something else struck her even harder. The scar. One trainee had noticed it as Ken reached for the fallen towels. His expression shifted instantly. Confusion, fear, recognition of something he couldn't quite place. The arrogance drained from his face like water slipping through a sieve. And Elena saw all of it. Her suspicion became certainty. This man was not who the world assumed he was. The trainee who had bumped into Ken took a step back, his earlier bravado draining from his posture. His eyes stayed fixed on the scar along Ken's arm, the jagged line stark against his skin where the sleeve of his shirt had shifted just enough to reveal it. He swallowed hard, suddenly looking much younger, much less sure of himself. What happened to your arm?" he blurted before he could stop himself. Ken gently straightened the stack of towels he had gathered, his movements controlled, unaffected. He rolled his sleeve down without haste, covering the scar again. "Just an old injury," he said calmly. But the trainee didn't hear calmness. He heard history. The kind of history that didn't fit any story he had told seconds earlier. The other trainees grew uncomfortable, shifting their weight, glancing at each other with uncertainty. Their laughter was gone now, replaced by the prickling awareness that they had misjudged someone they knew nothing about. Ken placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. She leaned into him, still frowning at the group. He smiled softly at her, the kind of smile that held both reassurance and gratitude. "You always stand up for me," he told her quietly. "That means a lot. But they can't talk to you like that," Emma insisted, her voice cracking with leftover frustration. "You don't do anything wrong, I know," he said gently, "but sometimes the best thing we can do is not let their words change who we are." Emma lowered her eyes, still upset, but she listened. She always listened when he spoke in that calm, steady way. At the far end of the hallway, Elena watched with a tightness in her chest she hadn't expected. She had come to respect Ken's quiet strength, but seeing Emma defend him so fiercely and seeing him diffuse cruelty with gentleness instead of pride deepened something inside her. What kind of man endured humiliation in silence, yet raised his daughter to speak with courage and compassion? Elena stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. The trainees stiffened when they noticed her. They scrambled to stand straighter, their faces flushing with guilt. Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Training starts in 10 minutes, she said, her tone steady. "If you have time to gossip, you have time to review your flight simulations." The trainees nodded quickly, murmuring apologies under their breath before scattering toward the training room. But the one who bumped into Ken lingered for a moment. His gaze flicked to the scar again, then to Emma's small protective stance. Finally, he met Ken's eyes. "I shouldn't have done that," he said quietly, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Ken nodded with the same calm grace he carried everywhere. "Take care with your words," he said gently. "They carry weight even when you don't mean them to." The trainee nodded once more deeply. This time, then hurried after the others. Emma watched him go, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Did he just apologize?" Ken chuckled softly. "Sometimes people realize things when they least expect to." Elena stood nearby, her eyes thoughtful, her suspicions no longer vague impressions, but solid truth forming in her mind. The way Ken carried himself under pressure, the scar that hinted at battle rather than accident, the patience of someone who had once led with precision, all of it pointed to a story no janitor should have lived. And she knew she was closer than ever to understanding who he really was. When the hallway finally quieted, Ken crouched beside Emma again, smoothing the tension from her small shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes still fierce with leftover protectiveness. "Daddy, they shouldn't say things like that," she muttered. "You're not what they think." Ken brushed a soft thumb across her cheek. "What other people think isn't who we are," he said. "And you were brave. I'm proud of you." His steady voice grounded her, easing the storm inside her chest. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck in a tight hug. He held her close, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her trust wash away the sting of the morning. As he stood and took her hand again, Elena stepped forward from where she had been watching. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question him. She simply observed the way he guided Emma toward the elevator's gentle, patient, composed with a posture shaped by something far greater than janitorial work. Elena's gaze drifted once more to the sleeve covering his forearm. The scar hidden beneath it. The scar that had changed the expression of an arrogant trainee into startled silence. A scar that matched a classified incident she had never forgotten. Her suspicions no longer hovered in doubt. The puzzle pieces had started locking together, steady and undeniable. This man had once lived a life of precision, danger, and extraordinary responsibility, and he was hiding from all of it. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual energy, louder than the day before. Word of the morning's hallway incident had spread, quickly exaggerated by whispers and half-formed assumptions. Some staff were curious, others were judgmental, and a small group, those who admired Marshall's swagger, were eager for another show. They gathered near the center tables, glancing toward the door every few seconds. Ken walked in quietly with Emma carrying her small lunchbox in one hand and a folded towel in the other. They took their usual seat in the far corner, the same table where they always shared their simple meals carved out as their safe place in a room filled with noise. Emma sat down swinging her legs gently as she unpacked her crayons. She was calmer today, holding her father's hand just a little longer before letting go. Ken began preparing her sandwich with his usual careful movements, cutting the crust off, placing the pieces neatly on a napkin, making sure everything was just the way she liked. For a moment it felt peaceful again, but the peace shattered as soon as the cafeteria doors slammed open. Grant Marshall strode in louder than usual, fueled by the embarrassment he still felt from Elena's intervention the day before and angry whispers about his behavior circulating through the building. His stride was sharp with irritation, and his entourage followed him out of loyalty or fear. It was always hard to tell which. His gaze swept the room and locked onto Ken immediately. "There he is," Marshall muttered loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. The ghost everyone's suddenly talking about. A few heads turned, others pretended not to watch while stealing quick glances. Marshall marched across the room, his jaw tight. His eyes narrowed with a mixture of insecurity and bravado. When he reached the small corner table, he planted a hand on the chair opposite Ken and leaned forward. "All right, Janitor," he announced, voice booming across the cafeteria. "Enough hiding." Conversations halted, forks paused mid-air. The air thickened with tension. Ken didn't look up. He continued cutting Emma's sandwich steady and unbothered. Marshall scoffed at the lack of reaction. "You're going to answer a question today," he said louder, still needing the audience. "Tell us who you really are." Emma froze her hands, hovering over her crayons. She didn't look at Marshall. She looked at her father, waiting for his calm. Ken placed the small plastic knife down and finally lifted his eyes. "What do you want, Chief Marshall?" he asked softly. Marshall smirked triumphantly. "I want your call sign." The room stirred with confusion. A few analysts whispered to one another, unsure where this was going. Marshall continued, savoring the moment. "Every rescue tech has one, even the washouts." His voice rose. "So tell us, Janitor, what's yours?" Silence washed over the cafeteria. Even the humming of the refrigerators seemed quieter. Emma's small hand inched toward Ken's sleeve, gripping it lightly. Ken didn't flinch. He didn't tense. He didn't show the tiniest flicker of anger. He simply looked at Marshall with calm, quiet eyes, the same eyes that had watched storms, fire, and loss without breaking. And for the first time since he started working there, he answered. Ken held Marshall's stare for a long, steady moment. The cafeteria was so silent that even small sounds, an ice cube shifting in a cup, a distant printer humming, felt unnaturally loud. Staff who had been pretending not to watch were openly staring now. Some leaned forward, others froze in place. Emma clutched her father's sleeve, her breathing shaky, but her trust unwavering. Ken drew a slow breath. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he spoke. "Lone Eagle." A fork dropped somewhere near the serving station. Someone inhaled sharply. Another person whispered the name under their breath, as if afraid it might vanish if spoken too boldly. "No way, Lone Eagle." "That's impossible." The ripple through the room was instant. Conversations broke out in stunned, hushed tones. Heads turned, eyes widened. Even those who hadn't been involved in rescue operations felt the shock. Because everyone, every analyst, every trainee, every technician knew the legend. Lone Eagle, the drone operator who manually guided a failing rescue drone through hurricane-force winds when autopilot systems failed. The operator who maintained perfect control through collapsing rooftops, smoke-blind corridors, and near-zero visibility. The one who kept the drone alive long enough to locate and extract a father and his young child before its battery died mid-air. A miracle mission. A story passed around training rooms and late-night shifts like a modern myth. And then the operator vanished. No public statements, no commendation ceremony, no photo releases. The file ended abruptly. Rumors filled the silence. Physical injury, personal tragedy, grief that swallowed him whole. Marshall's smirk fell away like it had been slapped off his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His posture, always inflated with ego, deflated visibly. He stepped back once instinctively, as if the quiet man in front of him had suddenly grown 10 feet taller. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. She had suspected the truth she had pieced together, Scar's posture, reactions. But hearing him say the call sign out loud jolted her to her core. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It wasn't a coincidence. It was real. Lone Eagle was standing in her cafeteria cutting the crust off his daughter's sandwich. The room seemed to tilt around Ken, but he remained exactly as he had always been, calm, grounded, unshaken by the chaos he unintentionally unleashed. He didn't look at Marshall again. Instead, he turned toward Emma, brushing her hair back with a gentle hand. "Eat your lunch, sweetheart," he whispered. Emma nodded slowly, still gripping his sleeve, not fully understanding what had just happened, but sensing something enormous had shifted. Around them, shock swirled like an invisible storm. People whispering, eyes darting, hearts racing with disbelief. Marshall swallowed hard, trying to recover, but every ounce of authority he had relied on seemed to evaporate under the weight of one truth he never expected to hear. The man he mocked, insulted, and humiliated in front of the entire staff was the very legend every rescue trainee wished they could someday live up to. And Ken, unfazed by the revelation, focused only on the little girl beside him, because she was his world, and the rest, every scar, every mission, every myth attached to his name no longer mattered to him, not compared to her. The cafeteria remained frozen long after the single phrase left Ken's lips. Lone Eagle. 2 quiet words that carried more weight than anything spoken in the building for years. Those who knew the story felt their hearts race. Those who had only heard fragments of the legend scrambled to remember the details. And those who had mocked him, especially Marshall, stood paralyzed in a shock that drained the air from the room. Whispers began spreading in waves as if carried by wind. Analysts leaned away from their screens, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Drone trainees abandoned their trays and clustered near the table edges, trading looks of disbelief. Senior staff stood halfway from their chairs, as though pulled upward by instinct, but anchored by awe. "That can't be him," someone whispered. "It has to be him," another murmured. "The calm, the way he moves, the scar. I heard Lone Eagle was dead. No, I heard he disappeared after the explosion. He was in that mission, the one with the hurricane winds. I read the report. No one else could have flown like that." Their voices blended into a rising tide of realization. Ken didn't hear them, or maybe he chose not to. His entire focus stayed on Emma, reminding her to take small bites, nudging her juice box closer, wiping a crumb from her cheek. The chaos around him didn't touch him. Not anymore. That life was behind him, and he had no desire to step into it again. But others couldn't look away. At the entrance, Elena Carter stood completely still, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered near her lips. Tears filled her eyes, not tears of romance or dramatic sentiment, but pure emotional reverence, recognition, guilt, respect, all tangled into one overwhelming wave that left her breathless. She finally moved, taking several slow steps toward him, weaving through tables and stunned staff who parted for her without needing direction. When she reached the corner table, she didn't speak immediately. She simply looked at him with a soft, stricken expression, searching for confirmation, even though she already knew the truth. "Ken," she began, her voice barely steady. "Is it really you? Are you Lone Eagle?" He didn't flinch under the question. He only held her gaze for a brief moment before nodding once, quietly, simply, honestly. Elena's breath caught. Her shoulders dropped, as if she had been carrying the weight of that suspicion for days. She blinked several times, a tear slipping free. Not from sadness, but from understanding. From the sudden clarity of everything she had witnessed over the past weeks. "You were believed dead," she said quietly. "After that explosion, After the final maneuver, the report said you didn't survive. Ken looked down at Emma, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. His expression wasn't proud or dramatic. It was gentle, tired, human. "I walked away," he said. His voice was soft, but it reached every corner of the cafeteria. "My daughter needed a father more than the world needed another operator." The sincerity in those words cut through the room like a blade, not harming, but revealing. Revealing the depth of his sacrifice, revealing the truth behind the choice he had made, and revealing the quiet strength of a man who chose love over legacy, healing over glory. Emma didn't understand the weight of his confession, but she leaned into him instinctively, sensing something important had just passed between the adults around her. Across the room, the staff stood in stunned silence, not saluting, not cheering, but rising from their seats out of instinct, out of respect, out of something deeper than organizational hierarchy. Not for a hero out of legend, but for a man who never asked to be seen at all. Marshall stood stiffly near the center of the cafeteria, his skin pale, his jaw unhinged. He opened his mouth, attempted a laugh, and tried to shake off the shock clinging to him like cold sweat. "Come on," he said too loudly, the forced grin twitching at his lips. "You expect us to believe that a janitor lone eagle, that's ridiculous." But even he heard the crack in his own voice. Before he could continue, one of the younger trainees, the same one who had apologized in the hallway, stepped forward. His face was steady, his voice firmer than anyone expected. "Sir, he said he's telling the truth." A hush fell again. The trainee swallowed but didn't step back. "I've studied that mission. Every operator hears about it on day one. The movements, the precision, the scar he has matches the report, and no one else carries themselves the way he does. No one." A few analysts nodded subtly. A senior coordinator wiped the corner of her eye, remembering the footage of that impossible maneuver during the hurricane rescue. Another staff member whispered, "The operator flew drones like they were extensions of himself. Just like..." His eyes trailed toward Ken, but Ken didn't react to the comparisons. He only adjusted Emma's napkin, keeping his world small enough for her to feel safe. Marshall looked around, watching his authority crumble in the faces of his own team. His smirk faltered completely. His voice, usually inflated with arrogance, shrank into something brittle. "You're all taking a janitor's word over mine." No one answered him. The silence itself was an answer. Elena stepped closer to Ken, stopping just beside his table. She didn't sit. She didn't bow. She just stood there, humbled by truth. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. Gently. Ken kept his hand on Emma's back, his thumb tracing a slow circle meant to soothe her. "Because I wasn't trying to be found." Elena nodded, faintly understanding more than the words he said. He had been running from applause he never wanted, from grief he wasn't ready to speak aloud, from a world that turned him into a symbol instead of a person. "And because she needed me," he added, glancing down at Emma again, "she deserved a father who wasn't one breath away from disaster." Those words settled into every heart in the room. A few people blinked away tears. Others looked down at their hands, ashamed of how easily they had judged a man who had carried more than any of them could have imagined. Ken lifted his daughter's sandwich again, as if the world weren't watching, as if nothing around him had changed. But everything had. And everyone in that cafeteria knew it. They weren't standing for a legend. They were standing for a father who walked away from greatness because he chose love instead. The cafeteria slowly returned to motion, but the atmosphere remained thick with awe and unanswered questions. Ken gathered Emma's crayons, slid her lunchbox into her backpack, and gently guided her toward the side hallway where parents waited for school pickups. He kept his steps unhurried and steady, wanting her world to remain calm despite the storm swirling behind them. Elena followed at a respectful distance, waiting until Emma had skipped off toward the childcare aide who greeted her each afternoon. Only when Emma was safely out of earshot did Elena step closer. "Ken," she said softly, her voice careful, almost afraid to break the fragile quiet around him. "Can I speak with you privately?" He nodded once, not because he owed anyone answers, but because he sensed her sincerity. They walked toward an unused meeting room near the back of the center, a place filled with extra chairs, a dusty whiteboard, and silence that wrapped around them like a thin curtain. Elena didn't sit. She simply faced him with hands trembling slightly at her sides. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting us enough to say your call sign. I still can't quite believe it." Ken leaned gently against the table. His posture relaxed, but his eyes held shadows that had never fully lifted. "I didn't say it to be believed," he answered. "I said it because Marshall wouldn't stop." Elena exhaled shakily. I need to understand," she whispered. "What happened to you? To make you disappear the way you did? To make you hide behind a mop bucket? To make you become someone the world overlooks?" Ken didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, turning them slowly as if studying them. There were small scars along his knuckles, faint but unmistakable, each one a silent chapter in a story he never told. It was a mission, he said at last, the one people talk about, the storm rescue. Elena nodded. She remembered the reports, the grainy footage, the impossible survival of the victims. There was a malfunction, he continued. A drone lost its stabilizers over a collapsing building. People were trapped inside. 2 children. Their father. He paused, swallowing tightly. Backup systems failed. 2 drones crashed before I could override them. The storm was stronger than anything we'd flown in. It kept pushing the drones off course, slamming them against debris. Elena's breath caught as she imagined the chaos of that night, the wind, the collapsing structure, the desperate calls over the radio. "They told me not to take manual control," Ken said. Said it was too risky. Said it was impossible. He looked up at her, then his eyes steady but tired. But impossible didn't matter. Not when lives were at stake. Elena felt her chest tighten. She had trained operators for years, but she had never seen someone fly drones the way Lone Eagle had. It was as if the machines expanded, his reach became extensions of his senses. "What happened next?" she asked gently. Ken closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself against memories that returned like breaking waves. "I guided the drone inside," he said. Down corridors filled with smoke through holes in the walls, past falling beams. Every second counted. Every movement had to be perfect. Elena said nothing, letting him speak at his own pace. "And I found them," he whispered. The father shielding his daughter. A boy pinned under debris. I mapped their position, created escape routes with the drone's sensors. The fire was closing in. Elena's heart hammered. She knew the footage. She had studied the mission for years, but hearing it from the man himself made every detail feel unbearably real. And then she whispered. Ken opened his eyes again, his voice lower, shaped by grief rather than pride. The drone exploded. The drone exploded. The words settled heavily in the room, and Elena felt them echo in her chest. She had read the line in the report, "Catastrophic structural failure, operator injured," but hearing it spoken aloud carried a weight paper never could. Ken sat down slowly, not out of weakness, but because the memory pulled at him from the inside. The battery casing ruptured, he continued. A piece of shrapnel came through the console shield. Hit my arm, knocked me back, but I kept flying until I mapped the last safe path. He tapped the place where the scar hid beneath his sleeve. "That's where this came from." Elena's gaze softened. "They said you saved the team. That without your mapping, none of them would have made it out." He shook his head gently. "They saved themselves. I just gave them a chance." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent, but Ken wasn't finished. His voice softened further, weighted by a grief far deeper than physical scars. "Weeks after the explosion, he said my partner got sick. It happened fast, too fast. I kept working, thinking I could balance everything, thinking I could still be in 2 places at once." Elena understood instantly. "You weren't there at the end," she whispered. Ken nodded, the pain flickering briefly across his expression. "I wasn't. I was in the control room during another mission. she passed before I got home. And I realized I had spent so much time saving people I didn't know that I wasn't there for the one person who needed me most. A tight breath escaped him, quiet, but full of truth. I blamed myself, he said. I still do sometimes. Elena's eyes filled, but she didn't move closer. She sensed he didn't need comfort. He needed to be understood. That's why you left, she said gently. That's why I walked away, he answered. I didn't want medals. I didn't want attention. I didn't want to keep choosing missions over people I loved. When Emma was born, I promised myself she would have the father my partner didn't get to keep. He looked toward the hallway where his daughter had disappeared minutes earlier, his voice turning tender. Some people serve loudly, he said. I chose to serve quietly. Elena swallowed hard, realizing the truth with absolute clarity. The strongest heroes were not the ones who stood highest. They were the ones who knelt lowest and still carried the world with grace. The afternoon shift rolled in slowly, but the atmosphere inside the Public Safety Monitoring Center had transformed entirely. The building felt quieter than usual, not in volume, but in the way people moved, in the weight carried by their steps. Every glance toward the janitor's cart, every pause near the hallway where Ken worked held a new kind of awareness. Respect, reverence, and more than anything, regret. Ken stood near the supply room refilling a spray bottle and checking the mop head for wear. He worked with the same steady patience he always had. His posture hadn't changed. His voice hadn't changed. The only difference was the way the world around him seemed to shift, as if people finally realized they had been walking past a man they never truly saw. The first to approach was a young dispatch analyst barely out of training. She held her tablet tightly against her chest, eyes lowered in embarrassment. "Mr. Rivers," she said softly. Ken turned, offering a gentle smile. "Just Ken," he replied. She swallowed. I wanted to say I'm sorry for not treating you with respect, for assuming things about you that weren't true." Ken nodded once. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." Next came two drone technicians who had often laughed at Marshall's jokes. They shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, unable to meet his eyes at first. One finally spoke. "We judged you by what you wear, and that was wrong." It was the second technician added, "You didn't deserve that." Ken wiped his hands on a towel and offered them both a calm, steady look. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we choose to do after we learn from them." They nodded, humbled, and stepped back. Then came the trainee from the hallway, the one who had bumped into him, the one who had later apologized. He stood straighter than before, no arrogance left in him. He hesitated, then spoke with sincerity that carried through the hallway. "I want to be like you, sir." Ken's smile widened, warm and soft. "Don't be like me," he said gently. "Just be kind. That's enough." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with something deeper than admiration, a quiet promise to grow into a better version of himself. As more staff approached, analysts, coordinators, trainees, even veteran operators, Elena stood nearby, her presence steady and supportive. She didn't speak, she didn't interrupt. She simply observed the moment with a reverence she couldn't put into words. This wasn't a medal ceremony. This wasn't a press announcement or a special recognition. It was something more human, more honest. It was people acknowledging the hurt they caused. It was humility meeting humility. It was respect given because kindness was finally understood. Ken, in his quiet way, accepted each apology with the same grace he brought to every task, whether flying drones through burning buildings or wiping down a table. Even those who didn't speak approached him just to stand near him, their silence a gesture of remorse. And through it all, Ken never changed his posture. He didn't bask in recognition. He didn't act like a legend reclaimed. He stood the same way he always did, calm, grounded, gentle. As the line of staff slowly thinned, the building seemed to breathe differently. The tension that had once clung to the air like dust had lifted, replaced by humility, and the quiet recognition of a man whose life had been misunderstood for far too long. Ken remained steady, offering a patient nod or a soft smile to each person who approached him. He never rushed them. He never made their apologies feel small. One senior coordinator, a woman who had once dismissed him as just part of the background, stepped forward with tears gathering in her eyes. "You deserved better from all of us," she murmured. "I am so sorry." Ken shook his head gently. "I didn't come here for anyone to treat me better. I came here to give my daughter a peaceful life. The rest, it's just noise." His words struck something deep in the hearts of those who heard them. Kindness wasn't a performance for him, it was a way of living. Elena stood just a few steps away, watching the scene unfold with a quiet awe she couldn't shake. The sun through the tall windows cast a warm glow over Ken, highlighting the lines of fatigued strength and gentleness woven into his face. She saw the father who sacrificed glory to hold his daughter's hand. She saw the operator who risked his life to save strangers. And she saw the man who chose humility even when the world finally realized he was far more than a janitor. But the moment wasn't peaceful for everyone. Standing near the back of the hall, partially hidden behind a cluster of drone trainees, was Grant Marshall. His jaw was tense, eyes narrowed, posture stiff. He wasn't ready to apologize. He wasn't ready to understand. His humiliation burned too brightly, twisting into resentment instead of reflection. Yet even he could not deny the truth standing before him. Lone Eagle wasn't a rumor. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a myth. He was the quiet man he had mocked, the man he had shoved aside, the man he had belittled in front of his own daughter. Marshall looked away quickly when Ken met his eyes, unable to hold the gaze of someone he once believed inferior. Ken didn't glare. He didn't smirk. He didn't revel in Marshall's discomfort. He simply lowered his eyes and resumed adjusting the bottles on his cleaning cart, because that was who he was. A man who didn't need to rise above others to prove he mattered. A man who didn't need applause to validate his choices. A man who believed that dignity wasn't found in rank or uniform, but in how one treated others. When the last staff member stepped back, the hallway felt changed, lighter, clearer, almost renewed. Elena approached Ken and stood beside him, not as a director or superior, but as someone who had finally learned the depth of the person she had walked past so many times. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In her presence, in his stillness, in the quiet gratitude around them, the turning point had already happened. Respect no longer had to be demanded. It was freely given not to the legend of Lone Eagle, but to the quiet man who carried that legend with humility. The next morning, the building felt different the moment Ken stepped through the staff entrance with Emma. The usual hum of voices softened as people quietly acknowledged him with nods or small smiles. There was no spectacle, no loud praise, no dramatic banners. Instead, there was a quiet shift in the atmosphere, like the center itself understood that something meaningful had happened the day before. Elena waited near the main briefing room, holding a folder close to her chest. She greeted Ken with a steady look filled with respect and gratitude. "Good morning," she said gently. "There's a short gathering we'd like you to attend. Nothing formal. Just a moment for the team." Ken gave a small nod. He didn't like attention, but he trusted Elena. Emma squeezed his hand, eager and curious, sensing something special unfolding, even if she didn't fully understand it. Together, they walked into the briefing room where rows of chairs had been arranged, facing a small podium. Dozens of staff members were already seated. Some stood along the walls, and a few held quiet, respectful expressions instead of the usual hurried focus. No one clapped. No one cheered. The silence felt intentional, honoring the man who had earned everything, yet asked for nothing. Elena stepped to the podium. She didn't clear her throat or bang a gavel. She simply stood there for a moment, waiting until the room naturally settled. Her voice was warm when she finally spoke. "Thank you all for coming. This won't be a long ceremony, but it is an important one." She looked across the room, landing on faces that had been humbled, challenged, and transformed in the last 24 hours. Yesterday, many of us learned a hard lesson. We learned that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are carried out quietly, without recognition, without applause, and without reward. A soft murmur passed through the staff. No one dared interrupt. Elena continued, We often celebrate the loudest victories, the brightest achievements, the titles that shine on paper. But true heroism doesn't always wear a badge or sit at the command center. She gestured gently toward Ken. Sometimes heroism pushes a mop bucket down a hallway. Sometimes it ties a child's shoelace. Sometimes it chooses humility when the world expects pride. Emma's eyes widened as she looked up at her father, her admiration blooming in a way that melted him inside. "We are here," Elena said to acknowledge a colleague whose presence among us has reminded this building what integrity looks like. "We honor not Lone Eagle the operator, many of you have read about in archived mission logs. We honor the man who came to work every day with quiet dignity and who showed us that kindness is not weakness and humility is not invisibility." She took a slow breath, steadying emotion as it threatened to rise. "Ken Rivers, would you join me up here?" Every head turned. Ken hesitated, instinctively resisting the urge to remain in the shadows, but Emma tugged his hand with a proud grin. "Go, Daddy," she whispered. So he walked forward each step, measured each moment unfolding without ego or hesitation. At the podium, he stood quietly beside Elena, hands folded, daughter holding firmly to his side. The room waited, sensing the weight of what came next. Elena placed her notes down, choosing instead to speak from the heart. "Before we continue, there is someone else who needs to come forward." Her eyes shifted toward the side of the room where Grant Marshall stood, rigid arms crossed, pretending he wasn't uncomfortable. "Chief Marshall," she said, "you have something to address." The room stiffened. Grant's face flushed with irritation, but he knew resisting would only deepen the humiliation he already carried. Slowly, begrudgingly, he walked toward the podium. His steps lacked the confidence he usually wielded like a weapon. When he reached the front, he avoided Ken's eyes, staring instead at the floor as if it might swallow him. For a moment, the room held its breath. Grant finally forced himself to speak. His voice was strained, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Ken," he began, "I misjudged you." The words came out stiff, but they were real. "I treated you poorly. I mocked you. I let my position make me believe I understood who you were." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong." The room remained silent. No murmurs, no shifting chairs. Everyone understood the gravity of this moment. Grant continued, through his pride visibly cracked with every sentence. "I disrespected a man who deserved the opposite. I disrespected your daughter, and I disrespected the values this center is supposed to stand for." He forced himself to look at Ken's face. "I'm sorry." Emma watched her small hand tightening around her father's. She didn't fully grasp the political weight of the apology, but she understood kindness, and she understood when someone was trying. Ken didn't rush to answer. He stood for a moment, letting the tension settle until his quiet, steady voice rose above the silence. "I accept your apology," he said simply. Grant blinked, almost startled. He had expected anger, rejection, or some powerful speech. Instead, he received grace, pure and uncomplicated. Ken offered his hand. It wasn't a triumphant gesture. It wasn't a challenge. It was an invitation to rise above everything that had happened. Grant hesitated, then reached out and shook it. The staff exhaled collectively. Not applause, not relief, just a shared moment of understanding that something important had shifted among them. Elena stepped forward again, placing a small wooden box on the podium. "Now," she said softly, "there is one more thing." She opened the lid and lifted out a small engraved plaque. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't gilded, it was simple, clean, and heartfelt. The engraving read, "Acts of Quiet Courage to Ken Rivers," for reminding us what strength truly looks like. Emma's mouth fell open in awe as the plaque shimmered faintly in the room's overhead light. She squeezed her father's arm with excitement. Ken took the plaque, gently holding it like something fragile and precious, though not for the reasons the staff expected. He looked down at Emma with a soft smile, bending slightly so she could read it with him. "This is for you," he whispered. Her entire face lit up. The sun had already dipped below the buildings when Elena approached Ken and Emma in the nearly empty lobby. The day had been heavy in ways that even silence couldn't cover yet. There was a softness in how the staff moved around them, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had changed. Elena hesitated only a moment before speaking. "I'm making dinner tonight," she said gently. "I would like you both to join me, if you're comfortable with that." Ken blinked, taken by surprise. He wasn't used to invitations. Most people kept their distance, never imagining the janitor had anything to offer beyond a mop and a quiet nod. Emma looked up at him with hopeful eyes, as if already tasting the possibility of something warm and new. Ken gave a small, grateful smile. "We'd be honored." Elena's home was modest and welcoming, tucked in a quiet neighborhood lined with elm trees. The porch light glowed softly as she opened the door for them. Emma ran her fingers along the wooden frame as she stepped inside, taking in the warm scents of home-cooked food. The air felt different here, softer, human. "Please make yourselves comfortable," Elena said, guiding them toward the dining table she had set with simple ceramic plates and a small vase holding a single sunflower. She lit a candle not for formality, but for peace. Emma, comfortable as only a child could be, placed her backpack on a chair and immediately pulled out a handful of crayons and a folded sheet of paper. "Can I draw while you cook?" she asked. "Of course," Elena said with a smile that softened her features. "My table loves drawings." Ken sat nearby, watching Emma settle in, her little legs swinging beneath the chair. The glow in her face always eased something in him. Elena noticed it too. She watched the gentle way he looked at his daughter, as if she were the last safe piece of a world that had once fallen apart around him. As Elena stirred the pot on the stove, she glanced toward him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes." Ken looked down at his hands before answering. "It's been a long time since someone invited us anywhere." There was no bitterness in his tone, only honesty. Elena nodded, recognizing the truth without needing more explanation. "I thought maybe tonight could be good for all of us." Emma lifted her drawing and held it up proudly. "Look, I drew Daddy with a cape." Ken laughed softly, shaking his head. "I don't wear capes." "You should," she insisted, beaming. "You look cool." Elena laughed quietly at the exchange, feeling warmth in her chest she had not felt in years. She carried the food to the table, placing a bowl of roasted vegetables and a pot of stew at the center. The smell filled the room with memories neither adult had expected to confront tonight. Once they were seated, Emma clasped her hands together dramatically. "Can I start?" she asked. Elena smiled. "Go ahead." Emma took her first bite with the sincerity of a child who believed home-cooked meals could fix almost anything. For a moment, both adults simply watched her, the sound of her contentment breaking through the heaviness they had carried separately for far too long. When the soft clinking of utensils settled, Elena looked at Ken with a thoughtful expression. She set her fork down gently, as though preparing to place a fragile truth between them. "There's something I want to tell you," she said. "Something I haven't shared with anyone here in a long time." Ken didn't rush her. He simply waited, giving her the same patient stillness he carried through every hallway of the center. Elena drew a quiet breath, her eyes lowering for a moment before she lifted them again. "My husband," she said softly, "was a field responder." Ken's expression shifted gently, not surprise, understanding. He loved the work she continued, loved the idea of making sure people came home to their families at the end of the day. He used to say that saving one life was worth every sleepless night. She paused, steadying herself. 5 years ago, during a warehouse explosion, his team didn't get the evacuation signal in time. Their radios jammed. The tech failed. Her voice wavered slightly, though she fought to keep it controlled. He was one of the responders still inside. Ken felt something tighten in his chest. Loss recognized loss instantly. Elena offered a small, bittersweet smile. "That's why I joined the tech division of public safety. I wanted to make sure no other responder died because the tools weren't good enough." Her fingers traced the rim of her glass. "Your work, the protocols you designed, they saved a lot of people after that, including a few who were on my husband's old team." The room softened around the confession. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was the quiet kind of truth that reshaped the air. Emma, listening without fully grasping the weight, slid one of her drawings across the table toward Elena. "This one's for you," she said. "It's a sunflower because sunflowers look at the light." Elena blinked, her eyes warming as she took the paper. "Thank you, sweetheart. That's beautiful." Ken watched the exchange, touched by the way Emma instinctively reached into people's hearts. His daughter had always carried that gift, mending things she didn't know were broken. Elena turned back to him. "I judged you once too," she admitted quietly. "I saw a janitor who moved like a soldier, who watched the screens like a strategist, who carried a weight I didn't understand. I thought you were running from something." She shook her head gently. "I never imagined you were choosing something instead." Ken lowered his eyes, absorbing the words with humility rather than pride. "I walked away to keep Emma safe," he said, "but part of me still wanted to help, even if no one knew my name." The room felt full now, full of shared truths, shared wounds, and the early stirrings of understanding neither had expected from a simple dinner invitation. Elena placed her hand lightly on the table, close enough for comfort, but without pressure. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "Both of you." The changes began quietly, almost imperceptibly, the very next morning. When Ken arrived before sunrise, pushing his mop bucket through the empty corridor with Emma holding his hand, the world around him no longer felt indifferent. The first person they passed was a security guard who usually nodded without looking. This time he smiled warmly and crouched down to Emma's height. "Good morning, little one," he said gently. "You ready to brighten up this building today?" Emma giggled, offering him a shy wave before skipping ahead. Ken thanked the guard with a small nod. The gesture wasn't extravagant, but it carried sincerity, the kind that replaced assumptions with understanding. As the early shift clocked in, analysts who once walked past him without a glance now greeted him with kindness. Not with awe or forced admiration, but a simple respect for the man who had finally become visible to them. Some looked embarrassed, some humbled, and others grateful. A trainee paused near the entrance of the drone lab and cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, I wanted to thank you," she said, "for everything you did, and for how you carry yourself." Ken shook his head softly. "Just keep learning," he replied. "Learn with the goal of helping someone you'll never meet." She swallowed hard, touched by the sincerity of a man who never tried to impress anyone. Throughout the morning, small moments unfolded one after another. A coordinator opened a door for him. A technician offered him fresh towels instead of letting him retrieve them alone. Someone placed a small wrapped muffin on the supply cart with a note that said, "For you and your daughter." Emma found it while hopping beside him. "Daddy, look!" Her eyes glowed. "We got a snack." Ken chuckled. "Looks like someone wanted to be kind." Emma nodded decisively. "We should share it." He smiled. She always knew the right thing before anyone taught her. Later in the day, Elena walked beside him during her break, the two moving down the hallway at a comfortable pace. Staff stepped aside respectfully, not out of fear, but because they saw him now not as a rank, not as a story, but as a person worth making room for. Elena glanced at him with a small smile. "They're seeing you for who you've always been," she said. Ken wiped down a railing, thoughtful. "I didn't do anything different." "That's the point," she answered softly. "They're the ones who changed." He didn't argue. He rarely did. He simply let the truth settle in the quiet space between them. Marshall appeared only once that morning, standing stiffly near the operations board with a tablet in hand. He avoided Ken's eyes, though it was clear he felt the weight of his own transformation, or the lack of it. His jaw was tense, shoulders rigid, as if carrying emotions he wasn't ready to understand. When Ken walked past him, Marshall shifted uneasily, almost stepping forward to speak. But the words died before they formed. He wasn't ready. Ken, who noticed everything without ever making a show of it, offered a calm nod anyway. It was not forgiveness. It was permission to grow when he found the courage. And Marshall, though silent, felt the meaning. Around them, life at the center kept flowing. Dispatch radios buzzed, screens flickered, people moved with purpose. Yet the atmosphere felt lighter, more grounded, as if everyone had taken one step closer to the kind of community the center was always meant to be. not because they now knew his history, but because they finally saw his humanity. Afternoons in the building changed even more noticeably. Once Ken walked the halls unnoticed as staff rushed by, buried in screens and headsets. Now people slowed when they passed him, not to interrupt his work, but to acknowledge him with a gentle greeting or a sincere nod. The shift wasn't ceremonial, it was human. A senior analyst stopped him near the drone storage room. "Ken," she said softly, "would you mind looking at something?" She held up a tablet showing a drone's flight log. "There's an error no one can figure out." Ken studied the screen for a few seconds, tracing the data with quiet focus. "Your feedback loop is firing half a second too late," he said. "Shorten the compensation delay. The drone will stabilize itself." The analyst's eyes widened. "Thank you." It wasn't admiration in her voice. It was relief mixed with genuine gratitude. She didn't ask for more. She didn't push. She simply walked away with respect. Emma continued to charm the entire staff without trying. Security guards kept a small stash of stickers for her. Analysts gave her old, colorful ID lanyards she proudly collected. She wandered like a small beam of light through a building once known for stress and exhaustion. Every time she slipped her hand into her father's, the staff saw him differently. Not as lone eagle, not as a mystery, but as a father who chose a quieter life so he could raise his daughter with gentleness instead of grief. Elena often joined them during short breaks, walking beside Ken without needing to fill the air with conversation. Sometimes she asked him about simple things, Emma's favorite breakfast, or whether he preferred tea or coffee. Other times they spoke about the center's future changes that could improve training, moments of compassion that staff had begun sharing more freely. Ken appreciated that she never brought up his past unless he did. She spoke to him as a friend, not as a legend or an unsolved story. Marshall remained the lone holdout. He kept his distance in the cafeteria, arriving early or late to avoid crossing paths. Yet every so often he paused when he saw Ken guiding Emma or helping a trainee. Something flickered across his face, not bitterness, but the slow, uncomfortable stirrings of a man learning humility in real time. Ken never pushed him. He simply continued showing up with the same steadiness he brought to every corner of his life. Kindness wasn't his strategy, it was his nature. And for the first time, the entire center was beginning to model itself after that. Saturday mornings were usually quiet at the Public Safety Center. The building slept later on weekends, giving Ken and Emma a peaceful start to their routine. Emma loved these mornings. She treated them like small adventures. She swung her backpack lightly as they approached the main entrance, humming to herself while skipping across the pavement. Ken carried her lunchbox, the air crisp against his skin, and the early sun turning the glass exterior of the building into a soft golden mirror. He expected the lobby to be empty, expected the hum of lights and the quiet rhythm of a day not yet begun. But before he could step inside, he stopped. Something was different, very different. The entire staff, every analyst, every coordinator, every technician, every trainee, every guard stood outside the entrance. They were lined up in perfectly spaced rows, forming a narrow path that stretched from the parking lot to the front doors. Their uniforms were clean badges, polished posture, straight faces solemn but warm. Emma froze beside him, her hand tightened around his instinctively. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is everyone here?" Ken didn't speak at first. He wasn't sure he could. The sight hit him all at once, not with fear or confusion, but with a wave of emotion so unexpected that he had to steady his breath. No one moved. They waited for him. Elena stepped forward from the front of the line, dressed in her usual simple blazer, but her expression carried something deeper today, something respectful, tender, and full of conviction. She approached slowly, hands clasped in front of her, and stopped a few feet away from him. "Good morning, Ken," she said, her voice carrying across the stillness. He managed a quiet, "Good morning." Elena looked at the rows of staff behind her, then returned her gaze to him. "We wanted to show you something, not as a ceremony, not as recognition, but as gratitude for who you are, for the way you've changed this place without asking for anything in return." Ken's breath tightened. "I didn't do anything special." Elena shook her head with a soft smile. "That's exactly why you deserve this." She turned to the staff behind her. A signal passed silently from one end of the corridor to the other. As one, every person straightened. Their hands rose, not in a military salute, not in a formal gesture of rank, but in a simple, unified expression of respect. A hand over the heart. Even Marshall, standing near the far end of the line, placed his hand to his chest with a conflicted but sincere expression. Elena stepped closer and spoke clearly, her voice steady enough to reach the entire assembly. "A soldier protects his country," she said. "A father protects its future." The words settled into the morning air like a soft but unshakable truth. Emma looked up at her father, her eyes sparkling with awe. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his sleeve. "They're smiling at you." Ken finally let out a slow, shaky breath. It wasn't pride he felt. It wasn't embarrassment either. It was something deeper, an overwhelming mix of humility, gratitude, and the quiet ache of a man unprepared for kindness after so many years of silence. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. The moment held him gently, asking for nothing more than his presence. Elena extended her hand toward the path. "Walk with us," she said softly. "You don't have to walk alone today." Ken didn't move at first. He stood rooted in place, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. He had spent years avoiding attention, choosing simplicity, shielding Emma from anything that resembled the spotlight. Yet here he was, at the center of a gesture so sincere and unexpected that it left him without words. Emma tugged his hand again, encouraging him in her gentle, fearless way. "It's okay, Daddy," she said softly. "They're happy." That small voice gave him the strength he needed. Ken nodded once to Elena, then took a step forward. The crowd parted slightly, forming an even clearer path as he and Emma walked toward the entrance. Elena walked beside them on his other side, her presence steady but quiet, offering support without demanding anything from him. As they moved through the corridor, something remarkable happened. One by one, staff members bowed their heads slightly, not out of duty, but out of gratitude for the man who had reminded them what dignity looked like. The sound of footsteps on concrete echoed softly, blending with the morning breeze. It felt like the whole world had slowed down to honor a man who never asked to be seen. Emma glanced at each face as they passed, smiling shyly when someone smiled back. A few staff members couldn't hold back tears. Some trainees pressed their palms more tightly to their chests. Even seasoned analysts, hardened by years of crisis management, felt their throats tighten. Halfway down the path, Marshall lowered his head as Ken approached. It wasn't dramatic or forced. It was quiet, honest, and heavy, with the weight of a man learning humility. Ken met Marshall's eyes for a brief moment and gave a small, forgiving nod. It was enough. Marshall's shoulders dropped in relief. As they neared the entrance doors, the warmth of the moment seemed to settle inside Ken's chest. He didn't feel like Lone Eagle, the legend the world had once praised. He didn't feel like the janitor everyone dismissed. He felt something simpler and more true. A father, a man trying to build a life rooted in kindness, doing his best each day to protect the little girl whose hand he held. At the end of the corridor, Elena leaned in slightly and said in a soft voice, "This path, it represents the man you were, the father you are, and the future you deserve." Ken breathed deeply, his eyes burning for the first time in a very long time. Emma squeezed his hand one more time. "Daddy," she said with certainty, "you're really loved here." And for the first time since he had walked away from the world, he believed it. The sun was beginning to lower itself behind the city skyline when Ken and Emma stepped out of the public safety center. The long corridor of honor still echoed quietly in his chest, even after the last staff member had dispersed and the building had settled back into its weekend stillness. Emma walked beside him with a bounce in her step, swinging his hand, as if she carried none of the heavy emotions he wrestled with inside. They crossed the quiet parking lot, heading toward the small tree-lined path that led home. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and warm pavement, carrying the kind of peaceful silence that invited reflection. Ken breathed it in, slowly, steadying himself after a day he had never expected and never thought he deserved. Emma looked up at him, her expression bright but thoughtful. "Daddy, can we get ice cream on the way home?" Ken smiled at the simplicity of her question. "Yes," he said. "I think today deserves ice cream." She grinned and squeezed his hand tighter, skipping for a moment before settling into her natural rhythm beside him. Ken watched her for a few steps, struck by how much of his life's meaning lived inside that small hand holding his. As they reached the sidewalk, the soft sound of their footsteps blended with the evening breeze. Ken's mind drifted not to the applause, not to the corridor lined with people, not even to the recognition he had received earlier in the week. His thoughts wandered instead to the long journey that had brought him here. A journey marked by both love and loss, strength and grief, silence and healing. He remembered the first day he took the janitor job. He had walked through the same doors unseen, unnoticed, carrying a past he wished he could bury, but could never fully let go. Back then, he wasn't searching for recognition. He wasn't searching for purpose. He was simply searching for a place where he could breathe again. Somewhere small, somewhere quiet, somewhere Emma could grow without the shadow of his old life hanging over her. He had chosen anonymity because it felt safer than being needed by the world again. He had chosen humility because it felt like the only path that didn't reopen old wounds. But today, after the corridor, after the kindness, after the countless small gestures from people who finally saw him, he understood something he hadn't recognized in years. Healing had brought him full circle, not back to the man he used to be, but forward to the man he was becoming. Emma tugged on his sleeve gently. "Daddy, what are you thinking about?" Ken looked down at her, the corners of his eyes softening. "I'm thinking about how far we've come." Emma nodded, her expression curious. Do you mean from the center to home?" He laughed quietly. "More than that, sweetheart." They continued walking, passing familiar trees and quiet houses. The setting sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, painting the world in warm gold. Emma slipped closer to him, leaning into his side. For a long stretch of the path, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them felt full, not empty. It carried the weight of lessons learned, wounds mended, and futures opening like gentle doors. And in that silence, Ken felt something inside him settle, something he had waited years to feel. Peace. Not the loud kind, not the kind that arrives all at once, but the quiet kind that grows slowly like dawn, until you suddenly realize the night has lifted. As the street stretched ahead of them, Emma's voice softened. "Daddy, do you think Mommy would be proud of you?" Ken slowed his steps, the question landing gently yet deeply. He looked down at her, seeing her mother's warmth in her eyes. He had always known this moment would come when Emma's memories of her mother turned into questions instead of fading pictures. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I hope so, sweetheart," he said quietly. "I really do." Emma slipped her small hand into his again. Her fingers curled around his with the trust of a child who believed her father could carry any burden. For the first time in a long time, Ken felt that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. They reached the little corner shop and bought 2 cones, one vanilla for Emma and one chocolate for him. She laughed when the wind tried to tug her napkin away, and he found himself laughing with her. The kind of laugh that didn't hide anything. The kind that came from a place finally free to breathe. On the walk home, Ken's thoughts circled everything that had happened. The humiliation. The scar being exposed. The whisper of Lone Eagle in the cafeteria. The recognition he never asked for. The corridor of honor that nearly brought him to his knees. None of those moments defined his legacy. What defined it was this walk, this child, this quiet evening filled with simple grace. He realized then that true heroism wasn't measured by missions flown or lives saved in dramatic moments. It was measured by the small choices a person made every day. Choices to stay kind, to stay gentle, to stay present for the people who needed them most. Emma licked her ice cream and looked up at him again. "Daddy," she said, "I like who you are." The words hit him harder than any recognition ceremony could. The sun dipped fully below the skyline, leaving the world dressed in soft twilight. As they turned onto their street, Ken felt an unexpected clarity settle in his chest. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the turning point in someone else's life. Sometimes the quietest man carries the loudest legacy. As the evening settled around them, the message unfolded naturally, an invitation for every listener to reflect. Have you ever met someone whose quiet kindness changed your life? What story would you like to see Keanu Reeves in next?